A trend that started with Mali has spread across West Africa. From Mali to Burkina Faso and Niger to Chad and Senegal, all these countries have expressed their dissatisfaction with France's presence in their countries. As a result, they have all sent French troops packing. However, while these countries are taking this revolutionary step, West Africa's largest economy, Nigeria,
3.3 trillion euro debt. Europe's biggest shock? France is standing on a financial cliff. More than 114% of GDP, and that's no accident. Markets are getting nervous. Interest rates are shooting up, a mistake Europe must avoid. Just weeks left to cut 44 billion euros. If that fails, chaos could hit the Eurozone. But experts warn, cutting alone will never be enough. Without
of the French capital, protesters say the only way to break the cycle of chaos is for Emmanuel Macron to resign.
For Emmanuel Macron and his government, this is only the beginning of a long fight over who pays the price of reform.
France has lost its third prime minister in under a year.
The French government just collapsed because it's going.
Are now flashing bright red. In a major blow, Standard & Poor's has downgraded France's sovereign credit rating from AA- to A+. That might sound like jargon, but it's a huge deal. It's like a demotion in the League of Trustworthy Nations. Moody's, another major agency, hasn't downgraded it yet, but has changed its outlook to negative, signaling deep concern. The hard data behind this move is even more alarming. France's public debt has
proposed tax increases and spending cuts in the 2025 budget proposal. The French government is hoping to push those plans through by the end of this year, even if necessary without a vote in Parliament. Now, all this has led to a spike in borrowing costs for the French state. This Wednesday, the yield or return that investors were demanding on a 10-year government bond jumped to over 3% for French debt, while Germany's was closer to 2%. That means the difference between these two, which is no...
Let no one who is negative want to spoil what we are doing for ourselves in order to unite Africa. We belong to this continent. We don't mind having and bearing sanctions banning us from Europe. We are not Europeans. We have not asked for any inch of Europe, or any square inch of that territory. So, Blair, keep your England and let me keep my Zimbabwe. Mr. Chairman, having said that, may I say, people must always come first in any process of sustainable development. And let our Africans come first in the development of Africa, not as puppets, not as beggars, but as a sovereign people. I thank you.
The signs of the shift began quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, buried beneath the noise of global markets that always seem to chase the next crisis. In Paris, analysts insisted the turbulence in investment flows was temporary, a momentary realignment caused by global uncertainty. For months, they dismissed reports of rising capital flight, insisting that France's economy remained stable, sophisticated, and foundational to the European Union. But beneath their confident pronouncements, fault lines were forming. The first tremor arrived when a consortium of Middle Eastern investors announced that it was withdrawing from a long-anticipated infrastructure partnership in southern France. The project had been advertised as a symbol of renewed confidence in France's post-recession revival, but the consortium abruptly redirected the entire investment, nearly $18 billion, into a new manufacturing and logistics zone being built in Kenya and Tanzania. Paris tried to downplay the event, calling it a strategic diversification, but global markets understood the truth. The world's largest investors had lost patience with France's stagnation and were now turning their eyes to Africa. They were captivated not by the continent's past, but by what it was becoming: an engine of growth. Reform, resources, and untapped potential that demanded far less bureaucracy, offered far more opportunity, and carried a future that seemed brighter with every passing month. The decision triggered speculation across European financial hubs. For years, France had relied on foreign investment to stabilize its debt, fund new industries, and keep its large public sector afloat. When a nation depends heavily on external capital, perception can be more lethal than reality. And in this case, perception shifted rapidly. Investors who once saw France as a safe haven now saw it as a burden too slow, too expensive, too politically unpredictable. Meanwhile, Africa was in the midst of a renaissance that Paris had underestimated. Nations from West Africa to East Africa were rapidly reforming business regulations, offering tax incentives, building world-class industrial corridors, and expanding their renewable energy capacity. With massive populations entering the middle class, Africa represented a consumer market that surpassed projections year after year. In Johannesburg, Lagos, Cairo, Nairobi, Kigali, and Accra, new financial districts rose with shimmering towers that symbolized ambition and national pride. Tech hubs expanded, logistics megacenters emerged near new ports, and large-scale agricultural modernization attracted billions in capital. Africa was positioning itself not as a continent seeking aid, but as a continent seeking investment, partnership, and influence. Its bargaining power grew with each new project, each new trade agreement, and each new milestone. Global investors were not blind to the shift, and they acted quickly. Sovereign wealth funds from Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Latin America moved vast amounts of capital into African real estate, manufacturing, and renewable energy. Private equity firms shifted their portfolios, selling off assets in France while acquiring stakes in African fintech, logistics, agribusiness, and extraction industries. Paris watched the numbers with increasing dread. Billions in capital were evaporating from the French economy each quarter. Markets grew skittish. Bond yields rose. Foreign companies began reconsidering their presence in France, citing high labor costs, regulatory hurdles, and political volatility. Industrial outputs slowed, consumer confidence weakened. Even tourism, a sector France once relied upon, experienced erratic patterns as travelers redirected their interest to African destinations that offered both modernity and affordability. France tried to fight back with policy reforms, but the changes were too slow, too fragmented, and too late. Investors demanded simplicity, speed, and predictability. Africa offered all three. France offered none. The energy sector marked the next major turning point. For decades, France relied heavily on imported resources to sustain its industries, including uranium from Niger and oil from several African nations. But geopolitical shifts, combined with new African resource policies, disrupted these flows. Many African governments, emboldened by the continent's rising market power, renegotiated long-standing agreements that had long favored Europe. They demanded fairer pricing, greater local ownership, and higher export taxes. France resisted at first, but it quickly discovered that it had little leverage. Africa was no longer dependent on European revenue streams. It had diversified its partnerships globally. China, India, Japan, and South Korea stood ready to purchase Africa's resources at competitive prices, often with fewer strings attached. These new partnerships created a buffer for African nations that drastically reduced their need to compromise with Paris. What France once took for granted was now a privilege it had to fight for. When resource costs surged, French industries felt the pressure immediately. Electricity prices soared, manufacturing costs rose, and inflation began to creep upward. Citizens questioned why their country seemed increasingly unprepared for the new economic landscape. France's political establishment shifted blame, but the public saw through the excuses. The belief that France was an unshakable pillar of European economic power began to crumble. In contrast, Africa surged ahead. The continent's new oil, gas, and mineral policies empowered local industries and generated unprecedented revenue for national development funds. Infrastructure expanded at a pace Europe had not witnessed in decades. High-speed rail lines across East Africa, energy corridors spanning southern Africa, and new financial hubs built to withstand modern global competition. But it was the technology sector that delivered the final blow to France's investment confidence, Africa's fintech revolution exploded, attracting billions in foreign capital. Startups in Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, Senegal, Rwanda, and Egypt achieved rapid growth, leapfrogging traditional banking systems and reshaping digital commerce. Investors who once funded French innovation now poured their money into African apps, platforms, and digital services that expanded at lightning speed. In Paris, technology incubators struggled to match Africa's pace. High taxes, rigid labor laws, and cultural resistance to disruption hampered growth. Startups relocated to Africa. Drawn by supportive regulations, young talent, and access to massive emerging markets, the talent drain became a growing concern. especially as African cities became magnets for global innovators. France's crisis escalated when major European funds recalibrated their strategies and announced that Africa would now be their primary long-term investment focus. A series of press releases hit Paris like a shockwave. France tried desperately to reassure global markets, but the damage was already done. Investors had made their decision. Africa was the future, and France was too burdened by the past. The shift rattled European institutions. France had long positioned itself as Europe's gateway to Africa, using cultural ties and historical influence to justify its leadership in EU-African relations. But the new Africa did not need intermediaries. It negotiated directly with global powers and built alliances that bypassed Europe. Altogether, this inversion of influence became a source of embarrassment within elite French circles. France had always considered itself Africa's mentor, its protector, and its partner. Now Africa had become the global epicenter of growth, leaving France struggling to preserve relevance. The crisis reached a critical point when France's agriculture sector, already weakened by rising production costs, suffered a massive blow from African import restrictions. Several African nations introduced new economic policies, prioritizing local food sovereignty, banning or limiting imports of agricultural goods from Europe. France, once a leading exporter of food products to Africa, suddenly found itself shut out of a market it depended on. Farmers protested, supply chains buckled. Politicians argued, but Africa remained firm. African governments were determined to build strong domestic industries, and they were succeeding. Massive agricultural modernization projects, supported by foreign investment, dramatically increased local production, with improved storage, transportation, and processing infrastructure. African nations lowered their reliance on imported goods and created new export opportunities. France watched helplessly as Africa transformed from a major customer into a powerful competitor. Whether it was cocoa processing in West Africa, vehicle assembly plants in Southern Africa, or renewable energy hubs across North Africa, Africa was no longer content to export raw resources. It was building industries that directly challenged Europe's economic dominance. The final stages of the crisis unfolded in global financial markets. Ratings agencies downgraded France's outlook, citing declining investor confidence, stagnant innovation, unsustainable debt, and a shrinking global influence. French officials condemned the downgrades as political, but investors took them seriously. Africa, by contrast, received a wave of upgrades. Credit agencies praised the continent's infrastructure expansion, governance reforms, rising consumer markets, and strengthened global partnerships. For the first time in history, several African financial markets were rated as more favorable investment destinations than France. Paris could hardly believe it. The balance of economic power was reversing. Markets had spoken. Capital had moved. France found itself in a crisis it had not foreseen. A crisis not created by war or recession, but by global investors making rational, profit-driven decisions. They were not abandoning France out of sentiment, ideology, or politics. They were simply going where the future was being built. That future was Africa. France's government attempted to regain control of the narrative, launching emergency economic programs, updating investment policies, and promising sweeping reforms. But global markets had grown skeptical. The problem was no longer a lack of policy, it was a lack of confidence. Investors had lost faith in France's long-term competitiveness. And once trust is broken in global finance, rebuilding it becomes a monumental task. The real shock came when Africa's sovereign wealth funds, flush with new revenue from minerals, manufacturing, digital services, and energy partnerships, made unprecedented moves in global markets. They purchased stakes in major Asian ports, European logistic firms, South American agriculture hubs, and Middle Eastern renewable fields. The emerging message was unmistakable. Africa was no longer merely receiving investment. It was becoming an investor itself. This inversion stunned France. For decades, the nation had considered itself a source of capital flowing outward toward the developing world. Now Africa was sending capital outward strategically, powerfully, and with a vision that aligned with its continental interests. What France did not anticipate was how quickly global sentiment could shift. Investors responded not to the past, but to momentum, and Africa possessed momentum in every measurable category: population growth, energy expansion, digital adoption, infrastructure modernization, consumer spending, and political realignment. France, on the other hand, was burdened with slow GDP growth, labor disputes, high taxation, energy dependence, and internal political fractures. Then came the catalyst that sealed the economic divide. A coalition of African nations launched a unified investment protocol, simplifying cross-border business operations, harmonizing regulations, and creating tax incentives for multinational corporations willing to relocate operations to Africa. This continental framework opened the door for companies seeking speed, scalability, and market access. Corporations from the United States, Germany, South Korea, Brazil, and India began announcing relocations or expansions into African economic hubs. France tried to compete, but its regulatory environment was too rigid, its labor laws too complex, and its political atmosphere too unpredictable. Investors no longer viewed Paris as an efficient base of operations. They saw it as a liability. As investment announcements poured into Africa, France faced a wave of corporate downsizing. Factories closed, office hours emptied, ambitious infrastructure plans stalled due to lack of funding. Local governments pleaded for federal support, but the national budget was already strained. Paris attempted to appeal diplomatically to African leaders, but the conversations had changed. Africa was no longer negotiating from a position of weakness. It was negotiating from strength-setting conditions, outlining priorities, and protecting its own interests with a clarity the world had not witnessed before. Meanwhile, global energy markets continued to shift in Africa's favor. Massive offshore discoveries, renewable expansions, and strategic alliances fundamentally altered supply chains. Africa's control of critical minerals essential for electric vehicles, batteries, and advanced technologies gave it leverage over global manufacturing. Whoever controlled Africa's mineral supply chains controlled the next generation of technology, and investors understood this perfectly. France did not, when global car manufacturers announced that their future production centers would be located in Morocco, South Africa, Egypt, and Ghana rather than in European industry zones. It became clear that the tide had fully turned. Even French car manufacturers began shifting operations abroad, choosing Africa for its affordability, access to critical minerals, and proximity to expanding consumer markets. The psychological impact on France was profound. For decades, the nation had portrayed itself as the cultural, economic, and strategic center of the world. Now it was scrambling to remain relevant in the face of a global shift it never imagined possible. Commentators debated how France had lost its edge. Some blamed high labor costs, others blamed slow innovation. Some pointed to the legacy of strained relations with Africa. Others highlighted Europe's aging population and declining competitiveness. But the truth was far simpler. Africa had finally awakened. And when it did, global investors recognized the opportunity instantly. Africa's growth was not based on charity or luck. It was based on strategy. Nations invested heavily in digital infrastructure, renewable energy, logistics, education, and industrial policy. They streamlined bureaucratic systems. They built new ports, new roads, new pipelines, and new airports. They created economic zones designed to attract global companies. They formed alliances with Asian powers, Middle Eastern investors, and South American partners. They stopped allowing their resources to be extracted cheaply and began demanding value-added processing at home, and global investors rewarded this vision. France, however, remained anchored to a system built for a different era, a more predictable era, an era when Europe dictated global economics. That era was gone. As France's crisis deepened, economic indicators provided a stark picture. Investment inflows dropped to their lowest levels in years. Unemployment surged. Consumer spending declined, property markets stagnated, government debt climbed, and despite desperate attempts to revitalize growth, nothing reversed the downward trend. In contrast, Africa's economic indicators soared. African stock markets shattered records, currencies appreciated, GDP growth climbed, foreign reserves grew, infrastructure development accelerated, cities expanded with an energy that France could no longer match. And as African nations grew stronger, their political influence increased. They began shaping global debates on trade, energy, technology, and climate policy. For the first time, Africa dictated the terms. The climax of France's crisis arrived during a global economic summit. Analysts watched in disbelief as more global investors lined up to sign long-term agreements with African nations, while while France received only tepid interest. It was the moment Paris finally understood the magnitude of the shift. The world no longer saw Africa as a continent dependent on Europe. The world now saw Africa as a continent replacing Europe. France had not merely lost investors. It had lost relevance. The conclusion of this transformation was not marked by a single event, but by a realization shared by boards of directors, financial analysts, sovereign funds, and multinational corporations worldwide. Africa had become the center of economic gravity. The story of global investment had been rewritten. And France, once confident, once stable, once powerful, had become the cautionary tale of what happens when a nation underestimates a rising continent. The crisis Paris never saw coming had arrived, and it was irreversible.